Hello, welcome. I'm Doug Landahl, CEO of Lantego, and this is my review of the Cyber AB's recently released CAP, or CMMC Assessment Process. This has been released prior internally to those going through the process of becoming certified assessors. But this is the first time it's been out publicly. So a lot of us, like me, who will be doing CMMC preparation, but not a formal assessor, haven't seen this yet, but have been looking forward to seeing it and how it may affect any of our customers who are getting ready to prepare for the CMMC assessment. So I'm just going to walk through my comments on the CAP and also show you the CAP at the same time. I also have a diagram that I created that I think will be useful, but let's just go into it. So this is published right now. It's just out on LinkedIn, but I'll make it available other places. This is my review of the CMMC assessment process, and I'm just going to walk through them. So number one, thanks for doing this, Cyber AB and everyone else involved. We really need a document like this. That's a short-lived thank you because I'm going to follow on with, hey, step up your game. We really need to improve the level at which these documents are coming out. Doesn't look to me that it's very well organized. Looks to me also that there are some major elements that haven't been addressed, or maybe addressed in a way that I don't understand or agree with, and just a whole bunch of edits that are kind of telling of the implementation of this process so far. So, major concerns. Number one, this first major concern, and I have a couple of sub-bullets for it, is just the retention of evidence to substantiate assessment findings. Within the auditing community, it is typical, in fact even required, that the auditor retain the documentation so that they can substantiate any findings that they've put their name on or they've attested to. The idea that the OSC will retain this information doesn't seem consistent with that. If there is a concern about proprietary information, that needs to be addressed with NDAs. I don't think any C3PAO should enter into a contract with an OSC without an NDA, and that is indeed the case here in the CAP. So with the NDA in place, with encryption technologies and being able to trust the lead assessors or the quality assurance professionals, I don't think it should be a problem, but that should be either retained by the C3PAO or maybe the Cyber AB sets up a file share or something like that to protect the information there, but it should not be with the OSC. So I do in my comments show a couple of statements. Curious statement here, it says that the CMMC Code of Professional Conduct will not allow the C3PAO to retain proprietary information past the engagement. I didn't see that. I read the Code of Professional Conduct rather clearly and read through it, and in no case does it ever say this. You can't give it to someone unauthorized, you shouldn't keep it beyond, you shouldn't breach the trust, but there's nothing to say that you can't retain proprietary information consistent with an NDA. So I think that's an incorrect assumption or reading of their own code of conduct, and that confuses me or concerns me. Secondly, I mentioned I think it is the quality assurance professional job to retain the evidence prior to submitting anything and to substantiate the findings. I don't think it's a violation of a code of ethics to retain information under an NDA. Let's see. There's also a statement, and I will give a couple of section numbers here. Section 324, you'll find the sentence that the lead assessor is responsible for maintaining and protecting any additional notes and information from the assessment. Yeah, I agree with that. And wouldn't those have proprietary information in them? Any kind of notes about the assessment? So as long as you're doing that, you might as well retain all the evidence, which may be proprietary. So I see a lot of inconsistencies in terms of what should be kept and by whom, and whether or not it's a violation of a code of conduct. We also see section 324 that the OSC has to hash and retain the artifacts, and I just don't think that's a correct approach. It really should be the assessment organization that does that. Let's go into my second major comment here, the assessment team advice and recommendations. Can the assessment team provide any advice or recommendations on how the OSC should implement controls? No. I absolutely agree with this idea. That has been around for a long time. Anytime you're an assessor, you need to be objective. So if someone says, hey, how should I protect this? Should I use this algorithm or the other? Or should I implement this manufacturer's two-factor authentication or someone else's? Or maybe I should do IP addresses a second authentication. These kind of questions are questions about which control should I use to meet a requirement. And if the assessor makes a statement about that, hey, this one's stronger, or I would prefer you do this one, when the OSC implements that control, then the assessor is kind of obligated to pass them on that area because they suggested that. And this should not be allowed, and the CAP says so. The CAP goes farther to say you can't provide any advice to, and I'll use the quote here, how the OSC could improve or enhance the sufficiency or adequacy of their presented evidence, not their control. So if I have, let's say, a ticketing system that I'm using for change control and authorization of changes and security reviews of changes, and I give you one ticket or one ticket thread that shows you how it came up, who reviewed it, how it was approved, and where that is tracked, I think it's absolutely in the purview of the assessor to say, hey, one ticket's not enough. Now, this is not a recommendation on whether the control is effective, just is the evidence sufficient? So if I'm going to need to sample 8 computers, or I want 3 tickets, or I want to interview 2 security guards as opposed to 1 for each case, I think that absolutely falls under giving them advice on the sufficiency and adequacy of their presented evidence. And I think it's perfectly fine for the assessor to say that's not enough points of evidence or data points or pieces of evidence for me to conclude on the strength of that control. I do not think it makes the assessor no longer objective, and I think it still allows them to say, hey, thanks, now I have 3 tickets or change tickets for the configuration management process, and I still conclude that it is not strong enough because of the following. So I think they missed the boat on this one as well. Assessors should not provide recommendations on the controls to be selected and whether or not that control meets the requirement, but providing advice on sufficiency of evidence, I think, is perfectly in bounds. Let's see, and furthermore, they say under no circumstances should there be any advice, implementation assistance, or recommendations. I like that part on how they can improve and enhance their preparedness. I don't agree with that. So again, don't tell the OSC what controls should be in place or whether or not one control is stronger than the other or even what the settings should be. Let them come up with it and you judge the sufficiency of that. But telling them how to prepare or the evidence they might need is perfectly consistent, and it's right in line with saying, hey, here's the people we need to interview. And if the OSC provides you a list of people you would interview and it doesn't include the system administrator of the database, you might come back and say, hey, we need to interview the system administrator of the database. That is advice on the sufficiency of the evidence that's presented, and I think it's perfectly fine. So this absolutely needs to be addressed. What can the assessor say? What can they not say? And I think that's, if that doesn't happen, the value of the assessor goes incredibly down. Let's see, there's also a statement in here that the lead assessor is solely responsible for reviewing and determining the legitimacy and validity of the POAM. And a credible and effective POAM should include proposed mitigation approaches. So that's kind of interesting. So if the lead assessor reviews the POAM includes, here's a control I didn't meet. I implemented a ticketing system that does not have two-factor authentication or doesn't even require authentication of who submitted the ticket. I would say that's insufficient because you have an authorization problem. I don't really know who does that. And if they, if the POAM it says, okay, we're going to add an authorization approach, if the lead assessor reviews the POAM and determines the validity and the legitimacy of the proposed mitigation approaches, isn't that then giving an opinion on whether or not that control will be sufficient? I think we need to be careful here because, again, the key element to auditing is the auditor needs to be independent and objective. And this bullet here is opposite of what I've just been saying because we've moved on to a different kind of suggestion or recommendation. I think it is dangerous when the lead assessor is giving any kind of opinion on the proposed mitigation approaches. I think it's fine to say, hey, there should be something there. It should be sufficiently described, but for the lead assessor to say the way in which you plan to mitigate, that looks like it will pass. That's dangerous. So let's be careful not to go too far here, and I find that curious. The other thing here is the estimated cost of remediation. Okay, so the lead assessor really needs to say, wait a minute, you think two-factor authentication is only going to cost you $50,000. I don't think that's right. What business is it of his? I think you need to make sure there is an understanding by the OSC of how to implement, including it may cost money or time or staff. But I don't think the lead assessor needs to get involved here with dollars and cents and what something should really cost. So if we want to back this off to the lead assessor needs to make sure that there is an estimated cost or recognition of the cost, that's fine. But the lead assessor should not be weighing in on what a control should cost. So I think that is out of bounds here. Let's see, another major element here is a lot of what's in the CMMC model. It's 800, 171 are the requirements, and 171A is pretty much how you assess it, with some distinctions, but those are the basis. So if we're going to tie back, which we should, to 800, 171A, there are three methods of review. There is and one of those methods is test. I don't think that happens here. I think we need to fully admit that of the three methods, I believe it's examine, interview, and test. Examine and interview are happening. Test is not. Assessors will not lay hands on your equipment. They will not come up with a test script. They will not have expected elements, run the test, compare the results of the test to the expected elements. That's not happening. The OSC may run test or demonstrate things, but demonstrate is properly described under the examine technique. So let's just fully admit that we're mapping to 800, 171A. The assessors will do the examine, which includes demonstration. They will do the interviews, but we ain't doing tests. That's not going to happen. So let's just admit it. You'll see it described on page 22, and I think that's a mistake. There's also a lack of assessment sufficiency requirements. So, and this one's hard. Like, when is it good enough? If we're using the examine and the interview techniques in order to figure out if the control is properly implemented, to what extent do we need to do those? For example, if you're required to have an acceptable use policy, or you're required to have two-factor authentication, is it enough to interview someone, hey, do you have two-factor authentication? And if they say yes and describe it sufficiently, is that good enough? I think everyone listening to this would say no. That's not good enough. That's a technical control, and we'd like to see it demonstrated, or we'd like to see a configuration screen, or we'd like to bring up a login screen and let me see the two factors. So there's a bit of work to be done here, so that all the assessors will ask for the same sufficiency of evidence. And I think you need to roll up your sleeves and figure that out. I would suggest for requirements in which there is a document, the minimum sufficiency would be review of the document itself for expected elements, and interview of someone who has a role and responsibility for implementing what's in the document to make sure that they're knowledgeable of the document and they're knowledgeable of their role. I think that would be a baseline. For technical requirements, I think it's similar. There would be a sufficiency requirement of a demonstration, of viewing, something where I can take a look at the actual technical control, and then secondly, some kind of follow-up. Maybe an interview, maybe some work product that comes out of it, like a log. But I would say in most cases, you're going to look at least 2 points of evidence. Let's start spelling those out. It's not easy. It'll take a couple rounds, people have arguments, but let's start those. Because just leaving it up to, hey, there are 2 methods, have at it, is not good enough. Let's start marking what we'll need to do to have sufficient evidence for each of those. And the CAP doesn't even try to come up with any minimums. So at least one method, and it's up to the assessor, that's not going to do it. We need to do better here. I'd love to see the minimums like I just expressed. I'd love to see guidance on sample sizes or practices, and simply just giving me advice on what an interview looks like hey, an interview consists of questions. We get that, but who should we interview? What should the topics be on? How many people with the same role should we interview? Those kind of things we need to start getting at. The last really big one or major concern that I have for the CAP is the OSC reapply. So the organization seeking certification, that's OSC, they go through the assessment. They're likely to come out with a POAM, a list of controls that aren't quite in place yet, or practices that aren't quite in place yet, and they got 180 days to fix those. Now there's a limit. There are a set of controls that you can have in the POAM, and there's a set of controls that you can't. Roughly the ones that were 1-pointers under the DODAM can be in the POAM. And you've got 180 days to fix that. I like all that. You can't give someone several years to fix things because so many things change underneath them that I think it is absolutely the right thing to do to give them a limit. However, the way the CAP describes the reapply is the OSC selects a C3PAO and they go through and try to convince them that, hey, we have this stuff in place, and if they don't, they're out. That's it. Done. Why not loosen that up a little bit? Let the OSC hire as many C3PAOs they can or they want to within the 180 days. So if they think they have this all fixed in 30 days, they can't get advice from the assessor on whether or not these recommendations are good enough until they get under contract. The assessor says, hey, most of those are good, but you missed 2, they're out. Why not, if they do that within 30 days, they have another, 150 days to fix those 2 things that are still wrong? Hire that C3PAO or another and give it a shot. As long as they're addressing all of these things within 100 days, what's the big deal? So what if they took 2 swings or 3? I think the 1 and out is unnecessarily penalizing to an OSC, and I think it should be loosened. Give them the ability to hire as many as they want or give it as many tries as they want. By the way, if you're an OSC and you're relying on a C3PAO to provide you advice and prepare you for the certification, I think you're seeing the folly here. They cannot tell you whether or not that's a good approach. So if you're trying to decide what controls should be in place, you're not sure you have those requirements in place, the C3PAO cannot give you any advice. You can pay them money under a contract. They'll tell you whether it's good or not. They will not tell you, give you any suggestions on how to make it better. And you can contract them again and they'll give you a thumbs up, a thumbs down, and you can pay them again. So I think we kind of see in the DIB here the value of outside consultants like my firm who will do these kind of things. So shameless plug, but you probably expect at least one of those. And I like to tell people, where I'm coming from. Okay, I'm going to move to some general comments here. There is a lot of stuff within the CAP that is unnecessarily, or that is non-mandatory and described. So if you don't have to do certain things, why describe it? Saying this is what the assessment organization does. Let the assessment organization figure out what they're going to do and what they're not. I'll give you a couple of examples here. The initial contact from the OSC can be made through the marketplace. I think we're all familiar with the CMMC marketplace. They can call the C3PAO, they can send them an email, or they can fill out an intake form. So what? Why say this at all? They could meet them because they're in the same building and they meet them at the cafeteria. Who cares how the OSC makes an initial contact with a C3PAO? The only thing required is that the C3PAO be in the marketplace, be an authorized organization, and then later on we'll find out. And they put people on the team who have no conflict of interest. Just put the requirements in here. Let's not tell the C3PAOs how to do business, and let alone how to market their business. And later on you'll see, I don't think they should have much to say about the contract or the pricing or those kind of things. That's business. Just put the minimums in there. No conflict of interest, there must be an NDA, there has to be a contract, it must be an authorized C3PAO, and keep it to that. I'll give you a couple other notes in here, but it's all the same kind of thing. Let's see. They put a note in here that the OSC can request of the C3PAO a specific lead assessor. Maybe. What if I want to create a C3PAO where I say, we don't care. You cannot tell me which lead assessor you want. We'll assign you whoever we want. Why is the Cyber AB getting involved in the business of the C3PAO? Let them build whatever business they want. And if they want to allow you to select your lead assessor or interview lead assessors or be guaranteed a lead assessor that you had before, that's their business. Leave it out of the CAP. The C3PAO works with the assessment official to determine the anticipated level of effort, the cost estimate. Again, why? Leave this to the C3PAO. The CAP doesn't need to talk about this, and let's just do the minimums of what's required in the CAP. Let's see. The whole discussion in section 151 about framing the assessment is completely unnecessary. You'll also see on the screen I have the CAP here. So let's go to 151 and see what I'm talking about here. So here's 151. Sorry, I got a couple of my scribbles all over that. But here is how the assessment is framed, right? The C3PAO needs to figure out the scale and the time and the place and the manner and the resources and the level of effort. Really? Maybe there's a C3PAO out there that wants to do a firm fixed price on what the assessments are going to cost. I don't advise it. I think there are, and many of these things that they mention should be considered. But let's let business do business, and maybe there's organizations out there that don't want to take in all of this stuff. Why are you giving them advice on this? Why are we talking about it all? It's a business thing. It's not a CAP thing, and it should be out of it. So here's 151. The whole frame the assessment, the rough order of magnitude for how long it's going to take, the scope, who's going to be on the staff, what are the locations. It's a lot of these things, it's hard to get around putting them in there, but the whole description on how do you talk to your client, how do you estimate a project, what are the parts of it. The Cyber AB doesn't really need to get into it at all. Let's just stick with what's required. If an NDA is required, it should be. Just state that. All contracts between OSCs and C3PAOs must include an NDA and a conflict of interest statement, and maybe you have to say when it will be completed. If that's a requirement, put it in there. If it's not, don't even talk about it. Let's see, section 152 right here, identifying the lead assessor. It says that the C3PA replies to the OSC in writing and introduces the lead assessor. I mean, it's probably a good idea, but maybe I want to introduce the whole team, or maybe I don't want to assign the lead assessor quite yet, because it doesn't matter. They're all similar skill sets, and you'll meet him when he shows up. Again, business, leave it to the business. Let's see, there's a couple other areas in here where I think it's unnecessary, like the OSC's documentation. Section 158 says the lead assessor and the OSC point of contact shall jointly review the most recent self-assessment. It's probably not a bad idea, but there's plenty of organizations out there that they might just say, you know what, I didn't understand what that thing said at all. Why don't you take a look at it? My point of contact is not technical, and we're relying on you guys. Do we really have to jointly review it? Why are those hours that need to be spent? Again, might be useful in some cases, but let's not start dictating exactly how every single 3CPAO is going to operate, because we're not looking for a bunch of clones. We're looking for a marketplace that can provide the services and describe the services that are required. Let's see. During phase 2, the assessment team will conduct affirmation sessions on page 16. I guess that's here. And again, I don't think this kind of stuff needs to be stated in the CAP. You need to so this is the Cyber AB telling the C3PAO that when you have a contract with an OSC, how's that for acronyms, that you will conduct affirmation sessions either person or virtually. Yeah, that's kind of, you've kind of covered all bases there, so it's a true statement, but let's leave this stuff out of here. It's not necessary. And then finally, more of the unnecessary stuff. Section 174 right here says that the C3PAO may elect to develop an in-house spreadsheet. Yeah, so what? Maybe they will. Maybe it's an in-house database. Maybe it's an in-house set of papers or a whiteboard. Who cares? Leave it out. Okay, enough of my ramblings about what to leave out. Let's talk about what's required. What the Cyber AB said is a mandatory process. So, first one here, and these are ones that I question, maybe they don't need to be mandatory. The OSC shall communicate the general parameters of the assessment requirements, including the time frame, when it would be ready, the physical location of its assets, all of them would be included in the scope. Do we really need to call this out? And are all of them there? Maybe the OSC, says to the C3PAO, hey, I would like this done as soon as possible. I don't have a projected time frame. I don't know how long it takes you to do these things, so you tell me. And now I'm failing this requirement. And is it a requirement? Yes, it is. It says shall. So here is a requirement. It says the OSC is required to state the projected time frame. And if they don't, what's the big deal? Why not leave it up to the C3PAO? So It might think like I'm nitpicking, but when you create an assessment process and you use the word shall, that's a requirement. And we need to think hard about those requirements. Is, do we really need that? What do we need? What has to be conveyed from the OSC to the C3PAO, and keep it at that. All the rest is gravy. Here's another requirement. Upon agreement between the parties to proceed with an assessment, the C3PAO works with the OSC assessment official and the point of contact for the planning details. And this includes schedule, size of the organization, logistics, relevant contracts, prospective scopes. And there's some follow-on bullets there too. It's just so prescriptive on how to do things, and I think it goes beyond what's required. The lead assessor shall identify the methods, techniques, and responsibilities for collecting and managing the evidence, and 8 more bullets there as well. Again, I think it's a good idea, but you're telling people how to do their job, and let's just stick with, maybe I've got a team where one guy, we always do all the interviews together, and we always read all the documents together, and maybe I got a team of 2 worked in tandem. And if I don't put it in writing that, hey, this is how we're going to work together, I fail. I fail the CAP. So be careful when you use this shall. I think that the methods, the techniques, the responsibilities, they need to be conveyed in some manner, but there's lots of manners. You might have a working relationship. You might have roles and responsibilities within the C3PAO that are understood. And let's not fail those C3PAOs because of that. Section 162 talks about the selection of assessment team members, and I think this entire section needs to go. So yeah, here's the entire section. You shall consider all of these elements when you're applying when you're considering the assessment team. Now, not necessarily limited to the following, but it includes all of the following that you have to do. So you have to consider people's years experience, their specialization, their cost. Really, all of this stuff, I have to consider whether or not my assessment team member is a 1099 or an employee. Again, really getting into the business of how C3PAOs do things. I agree that if I was consulting a C3PAO on how to set up their business, we would discuss all of these things and how they want to go to the marketplace. So these things are probably considered, but they don't belong in the CAP. It's not required. It's not a required element of the assessment, and it needs to go. Section 163, this is the identification of the resources. Again, pretty much similar. All of this section is unnecessarily required. That you identify these things, you provide a recording detail, you identify and record. I mean, you state what the room configuration is. Look, I've done plenty of assessments in my 34 years of assessing, and I don't think I hardly ever put in a contract or even in an email, what's the room configuration going to be like when we do the interviews? I just tell them, I need a room for interviews, and it'd be nice if we can close a door. But, if you can't, we'll do the best we can. But I don't talk about, I don't identify the seating capacity and the room configuration when going on site. Yet, here it is, all described in the CAP as if it is required. Again, stay out of it. It's unnecessarily mandatory. The daily checkpoint seems baked in to the entire CAP assessment process here. I think in a lot of cases it's a good deal, especially if you're in a really complicated organization and you're pulling a lot of evidence. But there are times when we go to an organization and it's pretty simple. I'm going to be here for the next 3 days, doing physical site reviews or pouring through documentation that you didn't want me to leave from the organization. And if the OSC doesn't have time to meet with me at the end of every day, then I fail the assessment process. I don't think that's right. I think it's perfectly conceivable that I would, if I was an assessor, I would go on site. They would say, look, our documents can't leave our place. You need to read them here. I would say it's going to take me 40 hours to read those, so I'm coming in on Monday and we'll talk about it Friday. And if I see anything that's giant, I'll schedule a call, but there is no need in this case for a daily checkpoint. So don't require it. In fact, don't even suggest it. Let the C3PAOs figure that out for themselves. Let them just determine their own business, and daily checkpoint should not be required. And it's all throughout the entire CAP. Let's see, it's also stated that during the interview session, the assessment team takes steps to ensure non-attribution. Again, why? I understand the benefit of non-attribution. If you're interviewing an organization and you say, hey, anything you say in here won't be attributed to you, the interviewee is typically more open and sharing. But there are organizations where there's 3 people and there's only one person that I'm interviewing about the technical controls. So to promise non-attribution is ridiculous. Anything I have that says, a technical person said this, we kind of know who it came from. There are other organizations that say attribution's fine. We're a very open organization. We have a policy that if anyone sees a problem, please bring it to people. There's no retribution on any of that. And no, we don't want you to promise them non-attribution. We want it out there in the open. Would that invalidate the assessment? I say no. It shouldn't invalidate the assessment. So don't talk about it. Leave it alone. Leave the C3PAOs to their own business and quit requiring these things that just don't need to be in there. The assessment team regularly reviews any additional time or duration impacts resulting in additional evidence collection and the status on a minimum daily basis throughout the assessment. Why? Again, like, what if an organization says, you know what, we don't have many documents, and I come in and I find a pile that's a foot high of documents I have to review. Yep, looks like I might need some additional time to review those. I might have struck an agreement with the organization of a firm fixed price. I might say, I don't care how many documents you have, I will finish those within 3 days. And sometimes it's quick and sometimes it's slow, but I don't need to meet with them at the end of the day just because there were more documents. I'm going to get my stuff done. Again, keep this stuff out of here. By the way, this sentence doesn't say shall and it doesn't say should. It's unclear, just based on those 2 things, on whether or not it's mandatory. But when you're writing a document that includes requirements in it, this is an affirmative statement. It says the assessment team regularly reviews. It doesn't say should regularly review. It says they do regularly review. That is typically interpreted as a shall. And that's why I'm pointing these things out as mandatory, because if you make this affirmative statement that the assessment team does something, then that is a requirement. Okay, I'm going to move on to order of task. And this is an area where I think the CAP could really, really benefit from any diagram whatsoever. There's not a single diagram or picture in this entire document, and it needs one. There are 4 phases. Inside those 4 phases, there are activities that are required. And at the end, within each of those phases, or at the end of each of those phases, in most cases, there is a requirement to notify the Cyber AB through EMAS and upload some stuff. So I think you could have a diagram that shows you this kind of stuff. Let me show you. It looks a bit like this. So this is not complete. It's pretty good, but I haven't gone through it, 2 or 3 times to make sure it's complete. But I think it is entirely useful to show you what is the CAP process. What is the CMMC assessment process? So let's go through this real quick. 4 phases: plan and prepare. So this is getting ready for the assessment. Getting the contract, getting the evidence, selecting the team, assigning the lead assessor, ensuring there's no conflict of interest. These are what I've gleaned out and agree with should be required elements. And at the end of all that, there is a pre-assessment form that is required, and it has to get uploaded to EMAS. So I think that first column there is a fairly good description, and if it misses something, they could take that and just change it up a bit. The second element here, or the second phase, is to conduct the assessment. And this is where all the work gets done. So you've already identified where the evidence is going to come from. Like, we will interview these people, or we will stand over the shoulder when you create a new account. You now collect that evidence. You assess it. And this is what I was talking about before, the examine and the interview portions, where you assess the strength of the evidence. You need to assess the third parties. Now, that bullet can get entirely blown up. Many others have talked about this area as well. It's difficult in your cloud service providers or external security providers, whether or not they have CUI or they're just doing security enforcing services for you, for instance, giving you an encrypted tunnel. And I'm not addressing that in this bullet because it would get too complicated for the picture. You would then analyze the evidence and score it. At the end of the day, the practice is met or it's not met, or maybe it's not applicable with a reason. You record these results in the POAM or the set of practices that can get fixed before the final briefing, and you send an update to EMAS. The third phase here is to report the assessment results. Now, if you've already figured all of this stuff out, most of this work has been done, but you need to do the outbriefing to the OSC, give them the assessment findings, and then verify the results. The lead assessor and your quality assurance person would verify those results, and those results get submitted. If it's a pass, we're done. Third phase is the end of the assessment for any organization that gets MET or NA on all the practices. If the organization does not get MET or NA on all the practices, in other words, it has at least one unmet, it has a POAM that needs to be addressed within 180 days. So this is only for those conditional certifications. They've got 180 days. They need a new contract because the old one doesn't cover this. See, but I think why wouldn't a C3PAO put that in their contract, that if there's an unmet, here is the cost of doing the next one. And maybe it's free or maybe it's a percentage. It's up to the C3PAO to figure that out. They assign the lead assessor and the quality assessors and the team members. It's a lot of what was done in the first three phases. It's just quicker because it's a smaller set of practices. They manage conflict of interest. They review and update the POAM. And if everything is fine, they submit those reassessment results and they pass. Or they submit the reassessment results and they don't pass. So a diagram like this took me a little bit of time to put together, but it was a lot more helpful to me in understanding the CAP than the entire 50 pages of the CAP document. So Cyber AB, take this diagram or create something like it, and let's help people understand this a little bit better of what's going on in there. So back to order of tasks, and I apologize for the length of this video. If you're still hanging on there, you are a CMMC geek, so enjoy the rest. I'm with you. So the order of task, I think it's gets rather confusing. There are a lot of, so the way the document is structured, anything starting with a 1 here is talking about phase 1. And it's not until these numbers start with a 2 that you're talking about phase 2. And of course, the same thing with phase 3, which is way the heck down here. Yeah, so now you're talking about phase 3. However, in chapter 1, they talk about chapter 2 stuff. And in chapter 3, they talk about chapter 1 stuff that should have been done. And that's just confusing. In the diagram that I used, I didn't do that. And it makes it more easy to digest. So don't do this kind of thing. So here, on page 16 in phase 1, it says during phase 2. Well, cut it out. Put that in phase 2. It shouldn't be here at all. On page 23, which is phase 2, it talks about the final decision, which is phase 3. So that shouldn't be there. Let's see, same thing with section 243. It talks about the dispute process. Why would you dispute anything while the assessment is being conducted? Phase 2 is conducting the assessment. We're still grabbing evidence and analyzing it. There is no room for a dispute yet. You only dispute after the briefing or the final briefing. So this should not be in phase 2. And then phase 4, top of the page, it says the final poem must be validated by phase 2. Great. Describe that in phase 2. And then this thing has to be done, the assessment results have to be uploaded in phase 3. Again, it doesn't belong in the description of phase 4. And I understand it's a review, but if you had a nice diagram and you stuck with only the necessary mandatory elements, this document gets a whole lot simpler. And doing this little flashback, describing previous phases does not help anybody. All right, I'll move on to use of terms. When you write a document that is a requirements document, what the assessors have to do, you have to be very careful with the use of shall and should and must and affirmative statements. Those sentences without must or shall or should that just says the assessment organization does, right, contracts with, the assessment organization hashes. Those are requirements as well because they're affirmative statements. So be very careful with those. There are quite a few what I think are mistakes, whether intentional or not. For instance, the OSC assessment official must be an employee of the organization that's being assessed. Yes, I think they must, but in the CAP, they mention right up front here is that we use the word shall to connote a requirement. Not must, not will, not affirmative statement, just the word shall. This is not the word shall, this is the word must. So expand this convention to say shall, must, or affirmative statements connote a requirement. So I'm not disagreeing with this as being a requirement, I'm just disagreeing with the word must is not been included in the document conventions on page 3. Let's see, this one is a use of will, right? So same thing, good requirement, just it uses will instead of shall. Let's see, there's a lot of assignments of tasks to the C3PAO. And this is something I just learned in MBA school, so it's kind of a nit of mine. That whenever you say the business shall, the business doesn't do anything. The CEO might do something, the lead assessor might do something, the quality assurance professional might do something, but the organization is not a person. So don't personify the organization, call out the role. And if it's not clear what the role is, just say a senior official at the C3PAO must. Let's do that. Let's see. Yeah, I give, also, there's a lot of assignments to roles that I don't know are necessary to do. For example, the lead assessor, this is on page 23, the lead assessor schedules affirmation or interview sessions with identified staff as part of the assessment planning activities. Really? Don't I have someone who can do that for me? I mean, if I'm a lead assessor, I'm one of the key members of the C3PAO and my time's valuable. If there is someone who can set up interviews, I'm going to get them to do that for me. That's how I'm going to structure my business. And here, this is a requirement that says, nope, you're not allowed to have anyone else at the C3PAO set up interviews. The lead assessor must be doing that. They're going to have to sit there and get on their calendar and their schedule and figure out they can't assign it to someone else. I think that is unnecessarily required. And this is just the same thing I've been saying before, but the flavor here is assigning tasks to roles in an unnecessary way. The lead assessor schedules test and demonstration observations. Again, why? The lead assessor generates the preliminary recommended findings. Again, why? Isn't it possible I can have a C3PA organization with a lead assessor and a near lead assessor, someone who's my senior assessor who's just not a lead yet? Couldn't I have them generate the preliminary results from my review? It's part of my training to create them into being a lead assessor. So I don't think you need to require the lead assessor to do this work of generating the findings. They're certainly responsible for reviewing and approving those findings, but generating them, I think, could be done by someone else on the team without an issue of quality. Lead assessor records the final recommendations of met, not met, NA. Again, you're giving the lead assessor busy work. They have to sit there, and if there's a document or a way in which we're tracking our evaluation, and it just needs to be copied over to the required format, I would put someone else on the team responsible for that and have the lead assessor confirm that it is correct. Review, approve, etc. But actually record, I don't think so. And then here is a set of things that are just really hard to read. I'm just going to say, rather than trying to figure out what it says, I'm just going to say try again. I don't understand what you said there at all. I'll read the sentence. An authorized and independent conformity assessment body that contracts with the organization seeking certification to conduct CMMC assessments and issues the CMC certification. Authorized C3PAOs are listed on the marketplace. That's just clunky to me. I think basically what you're saying is these are the organizations that are allowed to conduct assessments. They are authorized by the Cyber AB, and they're listed in the marketplace. Those sentences to me make a lot more sense than this one. Also on page 12, and it spills on to 13, it starts with, let's see, where does it say the vast majority? Here we are. Oh, this whole thing. This is the description of external cloud service providers, sometimes called external service providers, sometimes called cloud service providers. They're all over, sometimes called cloud computing services, but this description is extremely complex and convoluted, hard to push through, and it spills all the way down to here. I would say take a step back and let's figure this out. Also, with the whole ECSP, External Cloud Service Providers, we need to talk about what they do. If they are exposed to CUI, I totally agree that FedRAMP is likely a pretty good requirement. However, if they are providing something for me that I need to secure CUI, but they're not exposed to it, for example, maybe antivirus signatures. They're uploading to my system and telling me what the new signatures are. They do not get exposure to my CUI. They need to be FedRAMP? I don't think so. It should be discussed. And if there are different levels of assurance we need from these external entities, let's spell out the external entities and let's do it in a clear manner. External entities exposed to CUI require this. External entities that are security preserving, or I'm sorry, security enforcing, that provide us information, are required to do this. I think we can do a lot better than this page-and-a-half description that I stopped reading because I really couldn't quite push through and make much sense of it. I understand the area here, but it's clear to me that this area is not clear yet. Let's see, and then another one that is a clarity. This 80% of practices met. Anyone who's been involved with the CMMC, at least lately, understands that you can have some not met requirements. Those are the ones that were traditionally the 1 point under the SPURS scores. However, you can't have every one of them missing. And the bar that they put there is it's 80%. So if you add up all your METs versus your not METs, taking the non-applicables out of the equation, you got to get at least 80%. they say this multiple times. Section 231, let's see where it is here in 231. Here is section 231, where they list the ones that are eligible, and they explain the 80%. And 231, 2311. Sorry, yeah. I might have missed this number here. There isn't one, but 2411. Here they explain the 80%, and if you key on 80%, you'll see it a couple of times here throughout. We get it. Just say it once. You don't have to re-explain it. And then just a couple of nits, and I'll finish out. And thanks for staying in here. Table 1.1. So way up at the top, we've got a table of templates that are either required or not required. They're explained on page 7, and here we say whether or not they're mandatory or not. So you'll see here that the pre-assessment form is mandatory, the virtual assessment form is mandatory, the assessor conflict of interest is mandatory, the assessment in brief is not mandatory, the template. And we'll see here that this doesn't match up. I just said that the assessment conflict of assessor conflict of interest attestation form, that form is mandatory, but in this table it says it's not mandatory. Pretty easy fix here and here. The conditional practices as well. So just tighten that up. Let's see, elements of 1.2. So it's nice here. All the elements of this table, table 1.1, are described right here. That's nice. Then we have table 1.2, and none of these are described. I think that's just an oversight. Just describe them and indicate, you know, are those mandatory? Talk about that as well. Let's see. On page 15, they mention the CMC assessment plan template, but it's not in table 1.1 or 1.2. I think they should fix that and put it in there. All the assignments of tasks to the C3PAOs, yeah, this is my old, don't personify an organization. Organizations can't be aware. So the statement that C3PAOs shall be familiar with applicable templates. How is an organization familiar with something? The assessment team members need to be, but an organization isn't aware. It's not a person. All parties shall. I don't think it says all parties should be familiar with conflict of interest. I don't think that that should be a should. I think that should be a shall. Probably just an oversight. And then in the glossary, we describe what a CCP is. So here's the glossary down here, and CCP. Where is it? CMMC certified professional. Right here. Not now. Okay, it is now quick order. It says a person who successfully completed all certification requirements outlined and is becoming a level 1 for becoming a level 1 assessor. What's a level 1 assessor? I thought level 1 was all self-assessment, so I don't understand what a level 1 assessor is. Maybe I'm wrong, but it looks like an oversight or maybe a holdover from CMMC 1.0. Okay, so that's what I have. Thanks for standing by for this long-winded review, but I will make the review comments that you see right here available, and the diagram as well. I think I'll just add it to the comments, and along with this video. Chat me up if you have any questions. I look forward to your comments on the whole thing, and thanks for standing by.